Good morning. I'm Jason Marzak, Vice President and Senior Director of the Atlantic Council and its Adrian Arsh Latin America Center. Thank you for joining us today on a busy news Monday morning for the launch of Venezuela, a playbook for digital repression, the latest report of the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab, now available at atlanticcouncil.org. The launch of this report and today's conversation is quite timely as we look ahead to the upcoming presidential election in Venezuela on July 28th. Much of our work at the Atlantic Council reflects the fact that while it's clear that the Venezuelan election is far from international standards, it represents the best opportunity for a peaceful and democratic solution to the country's crisis. What happens on July 28th and the complex negotiations that will be needed after will determine whether Venezuela can rebuild its democratic institutions and reconnect to the global economy. This comprehensive study being launched today documents the ways in which the Venezuelan government has used digital tools to advance repression. It reveals a sophisticated and massive surveillance apparatus that includes a digital ID system, extensive data gathering applications, street video surveillance, and pervasive monitoring of phone and social media communications. The research exposes state-sponsored information operations targeting not only domestic audiences, but also extending their reach to Latin America, the US, Africa, and Europe. The report highlights systemic violations of citizens' rights within digital spaces and sheds light on mechanisms of internet censorship, state-sponsored phishing attacks, and the potential for shutdowns in the lead up to elections. Again, with the upcoming election, this report appropriately documents the irregularities in the Venezuelan election process and underscores how the digital space has been used as a tool of targeted repression in the electoral context. By bringing these issues to light, we hope to contribute to a more informed and engaged international community ready to support the Venezuelan people and their struggle to restore the country's democratic institutions. Complementing this report, the Adrian Arsh Latin America Center has been deeply engaged in supporting Venezuela's path for democracy and stability ever since I took over as its senior director 7 years ago. In recent months, we have worked tirelessly to facilitate processes behind the scenes involving stakeholders across the political spectrum in Venezuela. Last year, we published a report on advancing humanitarian agreements in these negotiations and worked to support talks that led to the signing of the Barbados Agreement, the roadmap that led to the election that will be playing out in just a few days. Building on this foundation, earlier this year, we launched the Venezuela Solutions Group, a multi-sectoral working group aimed at advancing political agreements to secure a democratic opening in the country. And just recently, the Solutions Group convened with Florida International University in Washington, D.C. to hold a private scenario planning exercise to game out different outcomes in the upcoming election. This will inform a policy memo being launched in the coming days in collaboration with FIU. Stay tuned later this week for a Twitter space with authors of that report, as well as a discussion with experts and journalists on July 29th, the day after the election, to analyze the situation on the ground immediately following the vote. I'd like to now turn to someone whose work I've followed closely over the years and our moderator, John Otis. John has been covering the Americas for over 2 decades, and for the past decade, he has been a correspondent for NPR and a special contributor to the Wall Street Journal and America's Quarterly magazine. He has reported on rising authoritarianism in Venezuela, the destruction of the Amazon rainforest, drug and guerrilla wars in Colombia, and much more. So with that, John, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jason, and thanks to the Atlantic Council for organizing today's event. Very timely, as you mentioned, with the Venezuela election coming up on Sunday. That's the first election in a long time where we don't know exactly really what's going to happen. The last couple of elections sort of seemed like foregone conclusions. So it's a great time to be speaking about Venezuela. And again, part of the reason why the regime has managed to hang on to power for so long has to do with digital repression. So it's a very timely issue that we're going to be speaking about today. And for opening remarks, I'd like to introduce to you Ben Roswell, who came in as Canada's ambassador to Venezuela right about when Nicolas Maduro took over the country in 2014. Ben was Canadian ambassador in Caracas for the following 3 years, has done a lot of great work on promoting democracy and is now the convener for the Network for Democratic Solidarity. So thanks for joining us, Ben, and over to you.
We can hear you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to you all today about a country that I care very deeply about. I was ambassador to Venezuela in a very critical time. I arrived in 2014, so amid the large-scale student-led protests the year after Maduro had taken power. So literally my very first impressions of Caracas was showing up at our embassy right in Plaza Altamira, where the protests would gather by the hundreds of thousands and witness this very public demonstration of the will of the Venezuelan people. By the time I left in 2017, that will had been very clearly disregarded by the government, and they had essentially suspended the constitution and transitioned to a full autocracy. Much of the key developments did happen online, and so I think this report is incredibly important to really understand what happened to Venezuela, but it's important well beyond as well. As the report makes very clear, and that I firmly believe, Venezuela is a sort of laboratory for repression in the 21st century. The way that authoritarian governments operate, the way that they try to deny rights, basic freedoms to citizens. There were experiments conducted in Venezuela, and they have been explicitly adapted elsewhere. And so if we want to see the future of authoritarianism elsewhere in the world, we need only look to Venezuela. And this report gives us an essential look into that. I now lead a group called the Network for Democratic Solidarity, which is essentially an attempt to link arms between the world's liberal democracies to show greater degrees of mutual support. It was inspired by the activism that I saw in Venezuela. Those hundreds of thousands, millions of people who went to the streets year after year after year and continue to. But also convinced that our democracies can't survive unless we forge a deeper commitment to protecting each other's political systems. Now, one of these central challenges that all liberal democracies face, regardless of where we are in that scale between democracy and autocracy, is this new wave of repressive tools and activities, which, consistent with this era of the internet, are digital in nature. I think one thing to point out about digital repression is that since the platforms on which these measures of repression are practiced are actually global in nature, the activities themselves are international in scale. That means the activities that the Maduro government is undertaking to deny its own citizens' rights are actually taking place well beyond Venezuela's borders. I believe that means that international actors are directly affected by the efforts of the Venezuelan government to repress its own citizens, and that international actors even have not only a legitimate role to respond to that, to expose it in the way that this report does, and hopefully to take action based on the results of this report, but I believe we have, as an international community, a responsibility to stand up and oppose digital repression. Truth is a global public good, and autocracies, the goal of their repression is invariably to distort and to manipulate the truth. I like to think that Canada has led the way in opposing digital repression in Venezuela over the years. And as ambassador in 2015, we launched a series of Twitter campaigns under the hashtag Se Habla de DHH, which is Let's Talk Human Rights, that reached millions of Venezuelans, trended on Twitter during a few major events. Essentially, what we tried to do is to use our voice as the government of Canada, I'm no longer with the government, but at the time, to help Venezuelans engage openly in a global conversation that helped give an alternative to the narratives of the Maduro government. The control of the narrative is something that I think the international community can help deny a repressive regime. In 2017, of course, we were invited to co-chair the Lima Group, by which the democracies of the hemisphere united to try and lend solidarity to the democratic movement inside the country. In 2018, Canada sponsored a request to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court to investigate crimes against humanity, all the way to the present, in 2024, providing support for the development of this paper. Just a quick note on the impressions. It's extremely thorough. It's extremely well documented, well sourced. I learned a lot. I saw a lot of the earlier phase of some of these trends. And so as I was reading it, for me, it was a little bit of like fast forward to the future to see what the logical endpoint of some of the experiments in repression, how they would fully play out several years into the future. As I say, I think these are trends that will play out in other countries and therefore well worth the read. My congratulations to Andres, Iria, and Danielle. I knew Andres from my time in Caracas, so not at all surprised about the quality of the paper. Iria and Danielle, lovely to read your work. I hope to meet you at some point. I should say in closing, it's discouraging to see the extent of the repression as practiced, some of the heartbreaking stories of individual activists, journalists, and others who have suffered terribly, unjustly at the hands of the regime. I have to also note, though, I think there were a few encouraging parts, indications, as I saw in spades in my time as ambassador, the creativity and the perseverance of the Venezuelan people as they're determined to practice their rights. I mean, I served in 5 countries abroad as a diplomat, traveled to dozens, and I have rarely seen a nation, a population more committed to democracy and human rights to Venezuelans. And I saw several examples of that. I love the anecdote of the mobile news team called El Bus TV, which I just thought was so emblematic of that commitment to Venezuelans have to practicing their rights. And that reminded me that Venezuelans have not lost faith in democracy. They have not lost their commitment to live freely, and therefore that it falls to those of us in the international community not to lose faith and to redouble our efforts to help them with their transition back to the rights and freedoms that they so justly deserve.
Thank you very much, Ben. And as Ben rightly points out, it is a very high quality report, very well sourced. And I'd like to add, it's also very readable, which we consumers appreciate very much. It's you can get through it, you can understand everything. It's not full of bureaucratic language that sometimes gets the reader lost. So I think it's something that a lot of people can pick up and read and get a lot out of. So now we're going to move on to the authors of this great report for a discussion on its contents. And I'd like to introduce Andres Azpurua, Executive Director of BE Inteligente. Andres, I've consulted with numerous times in my work looking into press censorship in Venezuela, and he's always been a great source, very, very up to speed on all of these issues. We're also joined by Daniel Suarez. He's a research associate for the Digital Forensic Research Lab at the Atlantic Council. And finally, Iria Puyosa, another great source for me on press censorship in Venezuela. And she is a senior research fellow for the Digital Forensic Research Lab, again, at the Atlantic Council. So welcome to all three, and look forward to your insights. So take it away. I guess we could start with Andres. Andres, you are in Venezuela right now, so it's good to get some of your observations. But when you guys, jumped into getting going on the research on this report, I guess what was kind of the starting point for this? Was there a particular incident that happened, or did you just see because so much media has gone online, you thought this was where we need to jump into things? What was sort of the basis for getting going on this?
Well, I think Iria is the one most apt to explain the origins of the report. However, from my end, it ties in very well with our continued work on the landscape of digital rights in Venezuela, mostly focusing on surveillance, censorship, and other threats that happen on the digital space, including state-sponsored digital attacks against dissidents and human rights defenders. So it's a continued work. I always say that it's very, very uncommon when I can quote figures from our last report whenever I'm talking about things going on in Venezuela, because things change so fast. be it censorship or any other violation to our rights on the digital space. And with these upcoming elections, the pressure is even higher.
Over to you, Iria. So let's talk about, you said a little earlier that you've been working on this report for basically the last couple of years. So what got you going on this?
Well, this report is a comprehensive assessment of the digital environment in Venezuela. We try to cover all the aspects. The premise of the report was this is an integrated system in which each piece contribute to the survival and consolidation of the regime. These pieces we are looking at were the control of the information environment through lawfare and censorship, the surveillance apparatus and the harassments against human rights activists and journalists, and the issues of connectivity, access, and the risk of shutdowns in the country. So we try to look at all these pieces in the way they are integrated in a system who everything contributed to the consolidation of the regime. So Andres worked mostly on the issues of connectivity, internet censorship, the blocking of websites, and the resource shutdowns, the incidents about outage, while Daniel was more focuses on the harassment against particular activists, all the case studies. We had several case studies of different situations in which journalists, politicians, human rights defenders, environmentalists were attacked by the regime using propaganda, trolls, and using lawfare to curtail freedom of expression. And we actually emphasize a lot of what have we seen on the attacks against women in politics. My focus was more on the surveillance apparatus. So most of the description of how the surveillance apparatus integrate the online car monitoring of communications, social media, intersection and monitoring, the issues related with the strict surveillance, how they deploy CCTV cameras with facial recognition around all the main cities. So how those all of that contribute to the repression or specific targets, person of interest they want to follow, but also to control politically most of the population. One of the things we explain in the report is the way the homeland system works and how that is being instrumental for electoral mobilization, coercing people to vote for the ruling party, and making recently in this for this upcoming election is being used for reshaping the electoral centers using data from to create from the Holland system to create polling centers in which they concentrate people who are more vulnerable to coercion, and they can control with the strict bosses the party had in a specific neighborhood. So all these the things we want people to take away is this is no scattered censorship, scattered information operations with no connection. It's everything very well integrated, and as former Ambassador Ben Roswell said before, is it has been a lot for all the digital repression tactics we see as well years later. We see something in Venezuela in 2009, 2010, and then those appeared information operations, similar information operations appearing in other countries in 2016. We saw the beginning of this homeland system in Venezuela 2016, and now we have similar systems in other countries in Latin America, in other countries in Africa, in other countries in Asia Pacific. So this is how we call the report a playbook for digital repression, because those are trends who are coming home later for other countries.
Okay. Great, Iria. Thanks so much for that. Danielle, so you focused a lot on very specific cases of digital harassment. Could you explain to the viewers maybe one or two cases of some of the most dramatic cases of digital harassment that you researched for this report?
Yes, John. We in the report we discuss and we tried to describe some cases where was evident how mostly the regime as the main actor targeted women. The regime frequently uses disinformation campaign to target and discredit individuals or organizations critical of its ruling, often resulting on personal attacks and smear campaign. Notable examples, as I mentioned before, include the targeting of female politicians with misogynistic and derogatory remarks, attempt to discredit journalists investigating corruption, and also amplifying narratives that question the legitimacy of opposition parties and electoral process. One of the key stages or periods of the reports was the electoral campaign. Some of the key sources that we use for the report was the United Nations Independent International Fact-Finding Mission report. They highlighted this trend during the opposition primaries, noting that prominent women in Venezuelan politics endured gender-based attacks, questioning their appearance, also their intelligence, our capabilities. These attacks often exploited traditional gender stereotypes to undermine women's credibility and the legitimacy as political leader. During the 23 opposition primary, female candidates such as Maria Corina Machado and Elsa Solórzano, they faced a barrage of online attacks with significant portion of containing misogynistic content. We also use as a case study the targeting of Tamara Adrián, a transgender politician and former National Assembly deputy. It highlights how disinformation campaigns with ties to the Maduro officials and supporters weaponize transphobia to discredit individuals and discourage their participation in politics. Tamara faced a wave of transphobic attacks on platforms like TikTok, where she was subjected to slurs and attempts to deny her gender identity. I want to finish this summary of these attacks against women, especially with our findings emphasizing the work that has been done, especially by Venezuela women, not only in politics, as I described it above, but also as we detailed in the report from CSOs, the media, and academia. They, amidst pressure coming from the state, they sustain their work for the freedom of expression, access to different sources of information, as we confirmed during this year of research, for playing a central role in the fight against propaganda, disinformation, and digital violence.
Great, thank you for that, Danielle. And I guess kind of as a sort of a basic question I have here for either Iria or for Andres. One thing for me that watching the Maduro government and Chavismo all these years, they often don't seem all that well coordinated. I mean, it's been a very unsuccessful government. The economy is in a mess. The oil industry is in a mess. It's a chaotic regime. But when it comes to repression and digital repression, do they seem to just sort of have all their ducks in a row? And I mean, it's this sort of monolithic security apparatus that's doing all this. I mean, this very well coordinated system that they have, because in some ways that kind of goes against the ineptitude of this government over the years. So I'm kind of wondering about that contradiction. So if either Iria or Andres or both of you could chime in about that they seem to be quite good at this aspect.
Yes, this is true. They are very low capacity in providing service to citizens and keeping even controlling the territory, having plagued with non-armed state non-state armed actors. So they have been neglecting the fulfillment of most of the functions we expect from a functional state. But when it comes to repression, when it comes to propaganda, they are very good. So that cannot show their priorities. They just focus in the things who allow them to survive and power, and they do pretty well on those things. We actually see some compartmentalization of activities, and in some case duplication. So some of the surveillance come from directly from the executive government. Some of the things like the Homeland Card belong to the presidents of the republic. So it be for the higher level of the executive, but we observe other things who are more connected with the military sector, and other things who are more connected with the political police. So it's like every sector of the repression apparatus has some functions related with the surveillance system. We also see how the censorship it came from the more technical side of the house. So the ones who are in the telecommunication industry, regulating and overseeing that sector, and the power of propaganda connects the military, connects the people working on social services, more widespread. Every minister had to contribute to the propaganda effort. So is widespread, is shared responsibilities with different agencies and different actors, but they are affecting this completely different what they do regarding service from the states we expect as a citizens.
Andres, is there one person coordinating all of this? Is there sort of a propaganda guru in the government, or as Iria said, is sort of every minister taking part in these meetings about how to do this?
So for what I've seen on in my work is that you have different constituencies that have different interests. So despite all the parts of the government doing very similar work and sharing resources, a lot of the work overlap, and it's like depending whose interests are being trampled or being affected by some activities, you have different structures in the government trying to surveil, attack, stop, or doing some of these activities. This goes into censorship, into surveillance. They'll have different techniques and different tools available to them, and they would even often sometimes advocate inside of the government, and sometimes in more public ways than one would imagine, trying to advocate for example, heavy repression from other parts of the government. And you would even see that sometimes slightly visible on social media when they are doing these kinds of advocacy inside of the government to trying to get some activists, human rights defender, journalists, or political initiatives stopped. And that's how sometimes those different constituencies interact and overlap on some of the same issues, but also sometimes different issues, again, depending on whose interests are being affected by those activities.
And Andres, did you guys see any involvement of the Cuban government in some of this, or any other foreign governments?
So specifically in my work, we haven't seen any explicit participation of the Cuban government. However, when it comes to censorship, and some of the digital attacks, and including cyber attacks that are state-sponsored, we see many reasons to suspect that there is collaboration with other state actors when it comes to technology transfer. This goes into some hardware, into software, surveillance equipment that is the same as the surveillance, like on the internet, the sophisticated equipment that is used for the most sophisticated types of internet censorship is also the same type of equipment that is also used for sophisticated internet surveillance. And that equipment is not homegrown in any way. So those kinds of things come from different countries, and you'll see evidence of collaboration. And also acquisitions of technology that doesn't come from what you would expect are friendly states to the Venezuelan regime, but you get like technology that comes from other countries like Cellebrite, and you'll see that equipment being used in Venezuela as part of the technology that upholds this digital repression.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Andres and Iria and Danielle, the authors of this report. We are going to now dig into it a little deeper and kind of broaden out the discussion to talk a bit more about Venezuelan politics and the upcoming election and how digital repression is impacting the situation for the election and the human rights atmosphere on the ground in Venezuela. And so for the next part of this discussion, we will be joined by Adam Fivenson. He is the Senior Officer for Information Space at the National Endowment for Democracy. Also with us is John Polga, an Associate Professor at the U.S. Naval Academy, and also a frequent source of mine when I'm working on Venezuela issues. And finally, our panel includes Tamara Tarasuk. She is the director of the Peter D. Belt Rule of Law program at the Inter-American Dialogue. So thank you all three for joining us. Really glad to have you here. And I guess I'd like to first start out with Adam Fivenson. Adam, one thing I'd like to know is how much do you see the Maduro regime as maybe an industry leader, so to speak, in using digital repression to undermine democracy? You know, how much is he sort of pushing the envelope here? And what lessons can the rest of the world draw from what's happening in Venezuela?
Sure. Thanks so much, John, and thanks to the Atlantic Council for the invitation. Just would key in on some of the comments actually that Ambassador Roswell mentioned at the beginning about Venezuela as really a test bed in many ways and a leading indicator of authoritarian innovation in the information space. And to draw a few examples that the report touches on that I think are really apt. First, the use of disinformation for hire tactics, which in Venezuela we see through these coordinated Twitter operations that the report describes, the so-called tuiteros de la patria. We're seeing that same tactic, that coordinated approach to amplifying messaging and taking over the information space, to elevating certain hashtags in other democracies at risk, currently backsliding democracies, which is a lot of our focus. For example, in the Philippines, in El Salvador, we've seen a lot of that in Ukraine as well. Another point would be the use of generative AI, which we've really seen the Venezuelan regime leading on. There was an example from last year from a so-called news operation called Casa de Noticias that was essentially trying to promote the Venezuelan tourism industry in the face of a lot of international reporting about the situation and dynamic on the ground, which of course maybe is not in all ways the most friendly for tourism given the economic situation, but also on Nicolas Maduro's TV program, on Con Maduro, he brought in an AI co-host at one point to, I would argue, to sort of bolster his reputation a bit, present himself as forward-looking and innovative. And of course, in terms of the use of generative AI, globally speaking, we're seeing this now across elections around the globe. Pretty much every single election now we're seeing at least one deep fake, if not two, that are taking over dialogue, that are influencing how people see each other and see key issues. I think, to me, the best example of this might be the recent Taiwanese election. Featured massive attacks that were attributed to the Chinese government, where AI, in one instance, was used to write a book that was smearing pro-democracy leaders in Taiwan, that was then used as a script, essentially for flooding the information space with manipulative social media videos. And then the last point that I would just touch on that I think we're really seeing as a leading indicator in the Venezuela case is the use of massive amounts of data for tracking citizens to create an incentive system, right, to participate in online information campaigns that target enemies of the regime and bolster their friends. This is the Homeland ID system. This is, of course, is enabled by new technologies that come, through partnerships with the Chinese government and other state-aligned businesses. So just as you point out, this idea of Venezuela as a leading indicator. And then just two other very quick points I would make. I think this is a great example of how authoritarian networks are expanding across borders, both downstream to Venezuela, in essence, with support from the Russian and Chinese governments, and then downstream from Venezuela around the region to other aligned state actors, for example, in Nicaragua and Bolivia. The report describes this as well. We talk about ideological support, technical support, funding, and oftentimes direct amplification of online messaging. And then lastly, I'd just say the case of Venezuela, I think, shows very clearly how the framework of disinformation, which we're defining as false information intended to harm and undermine democratic discourse, may be less and less relevant in today's information environment, where authoritarians are really increasingly using both true and untrue information to manipulate the public's understanding and perception of the world. And so a framework that might be better applied here is that of information manipulation, where again, true information can be used just in the same way that false information can be used in order to manipulate the public, to smear allies, or rather to smear enemies, bolster allies, and reprioritize what people care about in the information environment. So there's a lot happening in response to these tactics, things that, globally speaking, that we here at the National Endowment for Democracy are tracking quite closely. We know that, as I was saying, authoritarians are working together to accentuate attacks on democracy, marrying sort of global resources and expertise with local knowledge and understanding of the information environment in particular contexts. So one of the things that we're really advocating around right now and looking at and researching are ways that the democracy support community can better incentivize collaboration, both at a global scale in terms of how we share experience, how we share data, research, but also locally within countries, and how diverse actors, fact checkers, narrative researchers, independent journalists, pollsters, AI experts, how these kinds of groups can come together to better and more quickly understand emergent malign narratives, and then design and jointly amplify pro-democratic responses, whether that's fact checking or independent journalism that builds context, or whether it's efforts to sort of build democratic values and justify or explain some of those differences, and why it is in a time like this, where we stand globally speaking, why we should have to stand and make the case for democracy. It's a strange moment in some ways, but also it's becoming increasingly necessary, as we know that China, Russia, Venezuela, and other actors are becoming more effective in making the case for authoritarianism. And the last thing I would just say is the importance of data sharing at the local level between experts who are doing this research to, again, better understand more quickly what's happening in the information environment, so we can drive and elevate responses that either counter those malign narratives or build democratic values. So, it's certainly a moment where democracies are questioning, and maybe there's a lack of confidence in some ways in this sort of 18th year of democratic backsliding, as Freedom House calls it. But we do see a lot of really interesting and exciting examples of innovation, particularly coming from small local civil society, the kinds of organizations that NED supports, globally speaking, where we're seeing, very effective responses in the face of, some quite challenging attacks, as we're seeing, from the context of Venezuela. So let me stop there.
Well, thanks very much, Adam. And I'm glad you did lay out that there are things that that we can do, that news consumers can do, that average citizens, that voters can do, that journalists can do to try to combat so much digital repression and propaganda and fake news. That's extremely important. I think that really needs to be emphasized here. As I mentioned earlier in one of my previous comments, the Maduro regime has been disastrous for Venezuela, and yet Nicolas Maduro has managed to cling to power. So I wanted to move over to John Polga, and John, and ask you, Maduro, he's got this big election coming up on Sunday. All the polls show that opposition candidate Edmundo Gonzalez appears to have a really big lead over Maduro. Yet, he could still declare victory. He could still cling to power, even if he does lose Sunday's election. So my question to you is, how do you think that digital repression has helped Maduro hang on to power?
Thank you, John, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for the invitation. Digital repression is certainly one of the tools that autocrats around the globe use to stay in power, right, along with things like coup proofing, judicial control, and electoral manipulation, right, which are tools at Maduro's disposal as well. Famously, China, right, uses its vast government-run information operations to censor social media, spy on citizens, push an official narrative of political events, right, in an effort to block mass mobilization and stifle criticism. The same is true, we know, North Korea, Russia, Cuba, and certainly Venezuela, right? In Venezuela's case, these tools that the report enumerates have allowed Maduro to pursue what his predecessor, Hugo Chavez, originally called communicational hegemony, right? In which the government and the ruling party are able to exercise nearly complete control over the information space at the expense of independent media, right? So this allows the government to fragment and minimize independent and opposition media, pushing it to the margins, right? Pushing to places like WhatsApp. It also allows the government to overwhelm the information space with pro-government messages and propaganda, right? So this allows the state to create a narrative of its own narrative, rather, of political, social, and economic events, right? Casting doubt on other narratives. It silences criticism of the government. It subdues civil society by weakening these other dimensions of potential democratic contestation, right? As Adam just spoke of, right? The Sistema Patria is part of the surveillance state, which frustrates efforts at coordination. Because of this, the Sistema Patria and the Carnet de la Patria, right? This card introduced in 2017, in which citizens are forced to register with a platform to receive public salaries, state benefits, and at the time, COVID-19 vaccinations, right? It's also linked to the electoral registration database. So citizens feel like their access to food, jobs, or even housing depends on voting for the official party, right? So regardless of official support for the party, fear of surveillance and retaliation may be enough to improve the odds of electoral loyalty, right? And we have evidence of this in 2017 and 2018, and even in 2020. There are plenty of other ways in which the government is able to manipulate voters and close off information spaces. Significant efforts being put into social media attacks on democratic leadership, right, through disinformation campaigns and covert proxies like fringe websites. In short, I just think digital repression is obviously an invaluable tool for the regime that has allowed it to remain entrenched in power despite all the problems that you refer to.
Thank you very much, John. And when we talk about Venezuela and the human rights situation on the ground, digital repression doesn't always come to mind. A lot of times we think more about jailings and torture and all the people, all the political prisoners that the regime has taken. But I'd like to go over to Tamara Tarasuk and ask her about this issue, because Tamara, when you look at digital repression in Venezuela, including widespread surveillance and the online harassment detailed into this report, how do you see this as impacting the overall human rights situation in Venezuela?
Thanks, John, and thanks, Idia and the Atlantic Council for the invitation. Look, I think this report shows clearly that human rights problems in Venezuela have existed for a very long time. It's part of a broader pattern. It's very hard to pinpoint the exact date in which this all started, but I would say that a turning point for Venezuela's democracy was certainly the political takeover of Venezuela's Supreme Court by Chavez at that time in 2004, with his allies, was able to manipulate the judiciary at the top level in a way that it gradually became an appendix of the executive branch. And since then, it has absolutely failed to act as a check on executive power. And this increasing concentration of power during the Chavez years left the country in a situation in which there are today no independent institutions left to act as a check on the executive. And while human rights abuses certainly were committed during the Chavez years, this legacy of having destroyed democratic institutions is what Maduro inherited when he took office. And it's in this context that he was able to commit all sorts of abuses, including those reported in this document that is being released today, without any internal controls. So, today people are starting to pay attention to Venezuela again because of the political context, because of the upcoming elections. But for a very long time, Venezuela didn't make the headlines. That was not because the situation had improved, but rather because people were sort of getting used to human rights violations being committed in this Caribbean country in South America. But the truth is that even without making headlines, Venezuela, over the past few years and today, continue to face three simultaneous crises. A humanitarian emergency, where you have millions of people struggling to afford food or medicines. For a while, the government denied it existed, but now there's a UN deployment of humanitarian assistance. The UN actually reports that they have provided assistance to over 1 million people as of April on food security, on health, on water and sanitation. This is a hugely underfunded effort. The plan requires over $600 million, and it's only received $71.9 million to cover the humanitarian need. There's an ongoing crackdown on dissent. This report highlights a portion of that related to the digital space. But I think a general comment that applies to this and all the other cases you were mentioning, John, is that even if we don't see images of massive repression on the streets, there is a crackdown, and it is more targeted. It's clear in the context of a political campaign against members of Maria Corina Machado's team, supporters who host her or give her food and her team as they are in the campaign trail, cases against human rights defenders, and journalists, as mentioned in this report. And the third crisis is Venezuela has produced the largest migration exodus in the region ever. Nearly 7.8 million Venezuelan refugees and migrants have left the country. And very important to highlight that polls indicate that this number will grow if Maduro stays in power after this transition and the election. So I think that's the context in which this report must be understood. And it's a very good example of why we should continue to be paying attention to Venezuela, and that repression persists, even if it's not as newsworthy as before, when we saw many people getting killed on the streets or getting detained without due process or getting tortured in detention.
Thanks very much, Tamara. And yeah, you did mention the migration crisis, and that that's just here in Colombia, where I'm based in Bogota, Colombia. I mean, we still see Venezuelans pouring over the border, and there's a lot of speculation that could continue or even increase should Maduro remain in power after Sunday's election. Adam, I wanted to get back to you and just ask you very quickly if there's one or two just very practical recommendations that you would give people in Venezuela to try to wade through all the propaganda that they're receiving from the regime.
Well, it's incredibly difficult given what we've been hearing about and what the report describes as an information environment that really is saturated with manipulated content and efforts to control. But to the degree that people can access and find independent sources to triangulate, not just one, but multiple, it's always useful. To the degree that people are able still to engage with the rest of the world, which obviously is the case. We have someone on the call today from coming in from Caracas. Of course, that's tremendously helpful to partner with, engage with, work with international actors. Ned, of course, has relationships with partners that are thinking about this issue and working on this issue. And so to the degree that folks are able to look for those international networks, international partnerships that can sustain and support that type of work, we just think it's so important. So those would be two things that I would try to keep an eye out for and do to the degree that folks are able.
Thanks much, Adam. Those are two very good points and recommendations. I guess the other thing I see going on in Venezuela, and I'd like to direct this question to you, John Polga. Despite the digital repression, despite this avalanche of regime propaganda, people do seem to see through the Maduro regime's lies, and polls are showing that they're not buying what the regime is selling. The polls are showing that the opposition is leading, and that the opposition stands a very good chance of winning the election, at least gaining more votes than Maduro on Sunday. So I'm wondering if this is a pretty strong sign that all this digital repression at this point isn't working.
Well, I think that we see that the political, economic, and humanitarian crisis, much of which is exacerbated by this repression, has had an enormous impact on migration, security, geopolitics, the dissemination of liberalism, many things that report discusses. And the result of these elections will certainly determine whether there's a continuation of these tendencies, I think, or a reversal of these tendencies. And the fact that we're discussing that we don't know in an authoritarian regime what the results will be a week from now, I think is quite marvelous and points to the effectiveness of the opposition of learning, right, from I would say the past 10 years for sure, if not the past 20 years of operating under these repressive conditions. Using these alternative information spaces, social media and WhatsApp and Telegram and all these other different services that were not at their disposal. And the fact that Venezuelans are mobilizing despite fear or intimidation from the government speaks to the fact that they're fed up, how fed up they are with being repressed by the government. I think it's it's akin to maybe Chile in 1988. Would be maybe the most optimistic way that I can picture this.
Tamara, a question for you. Should Maduro lose the election? I mean, there's a lot of speculation about how the regime, if they actually agree to some kind of a democratic transition, how they would actually leave power, given the fact that there are U.S. indictments against Maduro and a $15 million bounty on his head. And there's also an international criminal court investigation of his regime for crimes against humanity. And so I'm wondering if you could just, I know it's a very complicated issue, but I'm wondering if you could just very, very quickly walk us through, how this might play out in, the case of how the ICC investigation might play out in the case of Maduro clinging to power after the election, or in the case of him losing and, making way for a democratic transition.
Thanks, John. This is certainly a very important point in this discussion. Look, Venezuela is the only country in Latin America where a government is being investigated by the prosecutor at the ICC for the commission of crimes against humanity. And this investigation looks at individual criminal responsibility of specific people who are implicated in the gravest crime. So it's not just state responsibility. When I covered human rights abuses in Venezuela, I documented extrajudicial killings, brutal torture, due process violations, mass prosecution, a judiciary that has been complicit with the abuses. And these are not isolated cases committed by rogue agents. If you look at, in particular, at the protests in 2014 and 2017, it was clear that they were being committed systematically. So you had the similar abuses across a period of time by different security forces in different locations, including in controlled environments, like, for example, military installations. And this is why the ICC is looking at what's happening in Venezuela. They are looking at allegations of deprivation of physical liberty, torture, rape, other forms of sexual violence, persecution on political grounds. We also have the investigation by independent experts of the United Nations fact-finding mission. They have exposed both the complicity of the judiciary in these abuses, and they have reported on ongoing targeted repression, which is what we were talking about earlier. These international accountability mechanisms are the primary avenue for justice for victims today, given the absolute lack of judicial independence in Venezuela. It's true that the ICC prosecutor has agreed to cooperate with Venezuelan authorities. This is called the principle of positive complementarity, and it's meant to push for proper internal investigations, which is very hard to imagine in the context today. So these international investigations, both by the International Criminal Court and those that can be opened by other judiciaries in the region through what's called the universal jurisdiction principle, are really a credible threat to those that are implicated in the gravest crimes. And this makes it a very interesting opportunity to open the door for a transition. Look, I want to be very clear. Some people in power, specifically those implicated in the gravest crimes, who could be prosecuted internationally for crimes against humanity, cannot be offered impunity for these abuses by any democracy in the world. These crimes are not subject to statutes of limitation, so the threat of prosecution will follow them always. Their best option is to turn to undemocratic allies for support and for a way out of where they are today. But however, many others who are not these top officials and who may be willing to take concrete steps for a transition to democracy, including, very important, recognizing their responsibility in addressing victims' rights to truth and justice, should understand that they have a better future in democracy than continuing with the repression. And that's where I think this is an opportunity in a transition to democracy, starting on July 29th. How can these folks be offered a bridge into a democratic Venezuela, and making them understand today that judges, people from the Electoral authority, people who are in security forces have a better future in democracy than clinging on to power with folks whose future is tied to the ICC.
Right. Well, let's hope that on July 29th, Maduro, if he does lose the election, that he opens the door for some kind of a bridge to a democratic transition and to facing up to all the crimes and human rights abuses, including this massive digital repression that the report lays out, that they've undertaken over all these years. It's a lot to chew on, and I'd like to encourage everybody to read the report. As I said, it's very well done, very well sourced, and it's perfect timing as well with Venezuela's presidential election coming up on Sunday. I'd like to now turn things over to Carrie Filippetti. She's the executive director of the Vandenberg Coalition. We've just heard a lot of great comments and analysis, Carrie, so I'll leave it to you. We give you the last word to sort of sum things up and tell us where all of this is headed, and very interested to hear what you have to say. So thank you very much, and over to you, Carrie.
Thank you so much. I'm really honored to be here to share the stage, so to speak, the virtual stage with so many friends and experts. So I want to zoom out a bit in my clothing and speak about where I see this report fitting within the broader context. So we live in a world of obviously what feels like increasing national security threats. There's the rise in the economic and military might of the Chinese Communist Party. There's the speed with which Iran is developing its nuclear capabilities. There's the unending bombardment that Putin is putting Ukraine through in his quest to rebuild the Russian Empire. And each of these threats poses a significant risk to the United States and our allies. But none of these threats alone really holds a candle to what I consider to be the most pressing national security risk of the modern era. And that is the end of truth. So as we've heard in this panel and in this remarkable new report from the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab, Venezuela is swiftly becoming a testing ground for precisely this type of authoritarian leader's use of disinformation and propaganda to undermine social cohesion, to sow hatred and confusion, and to really chip away at the very foundations of democracy. We know that democracy obviously rests on many freedoms, but top among those is the freedom of expression. No one is really truly free to express themselves if they aren't given access to the truth, to different perspectives, to free access to debate. So as the ambassador said in his opening remarks, and as was repeated by many of the other experts, this is not only about Venezuela. This report essentially shows the toolkit for both current and future authoritarians. And because of its digital nature, it's really global. So here in America, this type of disinformation and propaganda has resulted in hyperpartisanship, and in some of its worst cases, extreme political violence, as citizens are trained to believe the only way that they can protect vulnerable populations is to rid the world of the threat. So this has resulted in widespread conspiracy theories and self-hatred. Russian disinformation has caused many well-meaning Americans to describe Putin, who's a murderous president for life in Russia, as a victim of NATO expansion. And it, of course, has led to the reawakenings of ancient hatreds, as with the spread of Iranian, Chinese, and Russian origin anti-Semitism on college campuses. So as we know, fake news causes real violence. And as this report shows, it is not merely the spread of fake news or disinformation that comprises Maduro's repressive playbook. The dictatorship in Venezuela has used digital technology to persecute dissidents and human rights activists, including Rocio San Miguel, who is still in prison since her abduction nearly 6 months ago. It has weaponized the media and threatened the lives and freedoms of media workers, politicians, and ordinary citizens. And it's used AI technology, the first country in the Western Hemisphere to do so for these purposes, to spread lies about Maduro regime's successes in economic recovery. It's surveilled its citizens, as we've heard, controlled access to information, blocked human rights websites, and used technology to manipulate electoral results. Now, this is not to put the blame on the technology itself, right? I mean, technology, if anything, is amoral. It's neither inherently good or inherently bad. It's dependent exclusively on how we as humans use the tool. Recognizing the enormous potential of technology as a tool to maintain and broaden its grip on a long-suffering population, the Maduro regime has chosen to deploy it towards its own nefarious ends, and is one of the most sophisticated nations doing so today. Venezuela has always had the benefit and curse of being an exceptional nation and one of many firsts. The first democracy in the Southern Hemisphere, the first nation in the region to reach over 90% literacy, the nation with the largest gold and oil reserves in the hemisphere. It was actually also one of the first to eradicate malaria all the way back in 1962. But it's exceptional in another way. It's one of only 3 dictatorships in the region. It's a testing ground, as we've heard today, for undemocratic Chinese, Russian, and Iranian technologies that have brought more violence to the region. And it's one of the most sophisticated regimes in its malicious use of technology to oppress and repress its citizens. Now, thanks to the Digital Forensic Research Lab and the Atlantic Council, these strategies have now been brought to light, and the world can better understand the challenging environment in which the Venezuelan opposition is now operating. I am today, as I have been for many years, in awe of the optimism, the hope, and the resilience of the people of Venezuela, who are facing this brutal assault on their freedoms every single day and have mobilized so strongly in defense of their birthright, which is democracy. So I hope this report and this panel have highlighted not only what types of challenges confront the people of Venezuela as they face their upcoming presidential election in just under a week, but also how we can all do a better job of establishing policies that will protect our core democratic freedoms in the midst of an ever-growing technological environment. To read the full report, you can go to the Atlantic Council's website at www.atlanticcouncil.org and search for Venezuela, a playbook for digital repression. You'll find the full report there. Thank you so much for joining us. It's really an honor to be with you all.